On the morning of July the 27th, 2018, a 28-year-old midwife named Samantha Eastwood finished a night shift at Royal Stoke University Hospital, got in her car, and drove home to Stockton Brook, Stoke-on-Trent, exactly like she had countless mornings before, expecting nothing more unusual than a normal day of rest before her next shift. She never made it back to work that evening. Over the following 8 days, her family gave tearful interviews to national television, appealing directly to the public for any information that might help bring her home safely. Dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs searched fields across Staffordshire, and through all of it, one man stood right beside Samantha's own sister, comforting her, joining search efforts, sending texts from Samantha's phone to keep her family believing she was still alive somewhere out there. That man already knew exactly where Samantha was, because he was the one who had put her there. By the time the truth finally surfaced, it would reveal a betrayal so complete and a deception so sustained that police investigating the case would end up drawing a comparison to one of the most notorious child killers in modern British history, simply because of how far this man was willing to go to look like part of the search rather than the reason it was ever necessary. Before we go any further, if you enjoy true crime based on court records and verified reporting, make sure you subscribe now so you don't miss our next case. A quick like also helps this channel reach more true crime fans, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the morning everything changed, and to the man Samantha's family trusted completely, while he was secretly burying the truth just a few miles away. Samantha Eastwood was 28 years old, originally from Macclesfield, and worked as a midwife at Royal Stoke University Hospital, a job her colleagues would later describe her as being completely dedicated to, spending her nights on the ward helping deliver other people's children into the world. She lived at a home on Greenside Avenue in Stockton Brook, part of Stoke-on-Trent, and had previously been engaged to a man named John Peake. That engagement had ended, but Samantha had remained connected to Peake's extended family in a way that would end up defining the final chapter of her life. Because it was through that connection that she'd come to know Michael Sterling, a 32-year-old landscape gardener from Bucknall, Stoke-on-Trent, who happened to be married to John Peake's sister, making him Samantha's former fiancé Tilda Copyright's brother-in-law. It's a detail that, once it became public, struck almost everyone following the case as particularly hard to process, that the man responsible for Samantha's death wasn't a stranger, an ex-partner of her own, or someone from entirely outside her world, but someone woven into the family circle of the man she'd once planned to marry, someone who would have sat across from her at the kind of family gatherings, birthdays, and holidays that come with staying close to an ex's relatives after an engagement ends. What almost nobody around either of them knew was that Samantha and Michael Sterling had been carrying on a secret affair for roughly 3 years. According to what would later be laid out by his own defense barrister in court, it wasn't described as a particularly intense relationship, but one that had continued quietly in the background for a long stretch of time, with the two of them meeting regularly, often after Samantha finished her night shifts at the hospital. Sterling was a married man throughout the entire affair, and whatever arrangement the two of them had settled into over those 3 years, it existed entirely outside the view of the people who knew and loved them both, Samantha's family, Sterling's wife, and the wider circle of relatives that connected all of them together through John Peake. 3 years is a long time to sustain a secret of that scale inside a family that sees each other regularly. Long enough that it likely required constant, deliberate management on Sterling's part, carefully timed messages, plausible excuses for his whereabouts, and an ongoing willingness to sit across from his own wife and Samantha's former fiancé, Tilda Copyright's family, knowing exactly what he was hiding from all of them. It's the kind of sustained deception that, once it finally came to light, forced everyone connected to both families to re-examine years of ordinary family moments, birthdays, holidays, casual visits, wondering how many of those gatherings had unfolded with this secret quietly sitting in the room the entire time, hidden in plain sight by two people who had every reason to make sure nobody around them ever noticed. On the morning of July the 27th, after finishing her night shift, Samantha drove home, and at some point that morning, Michael Sterling was there with her in her bedroom. According to the account his own legal team would later give in court, an argument broke out between the two of them, specifically about the future of their relationship. Whatever exactly was said in those final minutes has never been fully detailed publicly, but according to his defense barrister, Charles Miskin, various things were said between them, an argument developed, and Sterling, in his own barrister's words, lost all of his self-control. Given that Samantha had just come off a full night shift delivering bobbies at the hospital, there's something particularly bleak about the timing of it all, an argument breaking out in the exhausted, vulnerable hours right after she'd finished a demanding overnight shift, rather than at some point when either of them might have had the emotional reserves to handle a difficult conversation more calmly, a conversation that, by every account given in court, had been building for some time as the pressure of maintaining a 3-year secret finally reached its breaking point. What followed was a physical struggle. According to the account presented at his sentencing, after the struggle and while Samantha was on the floor, Sterling put his hands over her throat and over her mouth and nose, and as a result, she died. Prosecutors and Sterling's own defense agreed that this had not been a premeditated act carried out with advanced planning, but a killing that emerged out of a sudden, violent loss of temper in the middle of an argument about where their secret relationship actually stood. What happened in the hours and days immediately afterward, however, showed anything but a loss of control. It showed a man capable of extraordinary, sustained, calculated deception, a stark and unsettling contrast to the account of blind rage his own defense had just given the court, one that would ultimately shape how both prosecutors and the judge chose to characterize him at sentencing. Whatever mitigating weight his history of mental health struggles was allowed to carry. After killing Samantha, Sterling wrapped her body first in a bedsheet and then in a duvet cover, binding it with parcel-type tape. He wrapped additional tape directly around her head and face. He then transported her body to a rural area near Caverswall, Staffordshire, close to a location called Baddeley Green, and buried her in a shallow grave in the countryside there, in a spot near Tickhill Lane. Having done that, Sterling didn't disappear or attempt to flee. Instead, he inserted himself directly into the search for the woman he'd just killed, using her own phone to send text messages to her family and friends, crafted to sound like Samantha herself, designed specifically to keep them believing she was safe and simply out of contact, buying himself time while the real search for her body was already being organized around him. Every one of those fabricated messages, sent from a phone belonging to a woman who was already dead, represented a small, deliberate act of cruelty on top of the killing itself, each one designed to stretch out the exact window of false hope that made the eventual discovery of her body that much harder for the people who loved her, people who had no way of knowing, as they read those texts, that the words in front of them had never come from Samantha at all. Over the following days, as Samantha's disappearance made national headlines and her family pleaded publicly for information, Michael Sterling joined the effort to find her. He spent time comforting Samantha's sister directly, offering support and reassurance to a woman desperately searching for her missing sibling, all while knowing with absolute certainty that the search would eventually lead nowhere good, because he was the only person who actually knew where Samantha's body was. It's a level of composure that investigators and prosecutors alike would later describe as chilling. A man capable of standing beside a grieving family member, offering comfort in one breath, while carrying the knowledge of exactly what he'd done and where he'd hidden the evidence in the next. To be in that position, day after day, watching a family's fear and desperation grow with each passing hour, and to still be able to offer hugs, reassurance, and encouragement, required a kind of emotional control that stands in stark contrast to the picture of a man who supposedly lost all self-restraint in a single moment of rage back in Samantha's bedroom. Samantha's disappearance triggered a substantial police response. Officers and sniffer dogs searched fields across the region for days, concentrating eventually on areas near Tickhill Lane close to Caverswall. Two men, aged 28 and 60, were arrested at one point on suspicion of assisting an offender, though both were later released with no further action taken against them, a detail that speaks to just how difficult the investigation initially was, with police still working to determine exactly who around Samantha might have known more than they were letting on. Throughout that period, Samantha's family continued speaking to national and regional media, giving emotional appeals asking anyone with information to come forward. Appeals that Michael Sterling would have watched unfold alongside the rest of the country, all while continuing to visit the family himself and maintain the appearance of a man just as desperate for answers as everyone else searching for her. On August the 4th, 8 days after Samantha had first gone missing, her body was discovered in the shallow grave near Caverswall, exactly where Sterling had buried her. She was found still clothed, wearing pajamas, wrapped in the duvet cover and bound with tape, with additional tape wrapped around her eyes and face. A preliminary post-mortem examination found no evidence of gunshot, stab, or other penetrating wounds, and further analysis of her neck was required to help establish the precise cause of death, ultimately confirming that Samantha had been smothered and strangled. For the family, who had spent 8 days clinging to whatever hope the fabricated text messages from Sterling had offered them, the discovery brought a devastating end to a search that had already taken an unbearable emotional toll, compounded now by the knowledge that the very phone messages they'd been reading as signs of life had actually been sent by the person responsible for her death. Michael Sterling was arrested and charged with murder, appearing initially at North Staffordshire Magistrates' Court before being remanded into custody. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors would later reveal a detail that added yet another layer of unease to the case, that just 2 days before he killed Samantha, Sterling had researched methods on how to end his own life, and that he had a documented history of mental health difficulties dating back to at least 2015. Prosecutors sought, and received, permission through the court to access his medical records as the case moved forward, though the defense's basis of plea maintained throughout that the killing itself had not been planned in advance. Prosecutor Jonas Hankin QC described the overall investigation as complex, one requiring extensive analysis of CCTV footage, telephone records, and automatic number plate recognition data before the full picture of what had happened could be properly assembled and presented to the court. That complexity meant the case took months to move from Samantha's death in July to Sterling's guilty plea in October, months during which investigators had to methodically piece together his movements, his phone activity, and the timeline of exactly when the fabricated messages from Samantha's phone had actually been sent, cross-referencing all of it against what they already knew about where Sterling himself had been during that same period. The case moved through Stafford Crown Court and then to Northampton Crown Court, where, on October the 22nd, 2018, Michael Sterling pleaded guilty to Samantha's murder. He appeared via video link, sitting at a table wearing a dark gray t-shirt, sporting a full beard, as Samantha's mother and sister watched from the public gallery alongside her ex-fiancé copyright John Peake, the same man whose sister was married to the killer sitting in front of them. It's difficult to imagine a more painful position for a family to sit in, watching, via a screen, the formal admission of guilt from a man who had spent years inside their extended family circle, who had comforted them during the search for Samantha, and who happened to be married to the sister of the woman's own former fiancé copyright, all 3 threads of the family's life tangled together in a single courtroom video feed. After Sterling entered his plea, his barrister Charles Miskin laid out the defense's account of what had happened, describing a long-standing but not particularly intense affair, an argument over the relationship's future, and a sudden, violent loss of self-control that ended Samantha's life. Detective Inspector Dan Eisen, speaking after the guilty plea, said Sterling's admission had spared the family a significant amount of additional heartache by avoiding a full trial. He noted with evident frustration that Sterling had been known to Samantha's family throughout the search, and that he had lied to them, and lied to police repeatedly over the course of the investigation, leaving the family unsure at various points who they could actually believe. It's a detail that captures something particularly cruel about this case, that the deception Sterling engaged in wasn't confined to the moments immediately after the killing, but extended across days of sustained, face-to-face dishonesty directed at people who trusted him specifically because of his closeness to their family. For a family already reeling from the disappearance of a daughter and sister, that layer of manipulation meant they couldn't even fully trust their own instincts about who around them was genuinely helping and who was actively working against them, a corrosive kind of uncertainty that far outlasted the 8 days of the search itself. Sentencing took place on December 3, 2018, at Stafford Crown Court, presided over by Mrs. Justice Sue Carr. In delivering her sentencing remarks, the judge described in detail how, after strangling Samantha, Sterling had picked up her body and carried out the elaborate, methodical cover-up that followed, wrapping her, transporting her, and burying her in the countryside near Caverswall. Michael Sterling was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of almost 17 years to serve before he can be considered for parole, a sentence that will keep him behind bars until he is roughly in his 50th year at the earliest. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Staffordshire police drew a comparison that underscored just how disturbing Sterling's conduct during the search had actually been, likening his behavior to that of Ian Huntley, the man convicted of murdering 2 10-year-old girls in Soham, Cambridgeshire, back in 2002, who had similarly taken part in public appeals for information about the very children he had already killed, appearing on camera pleading for their safe return in scenes that horrified the country once his guilt was finally established. It's a comparison police don't make lightly, reserved specifically for cases where a perpetrator doesn't simply commit murder and flee, but actively inserts themselves into the public search and grieving process for their own victim, exploiting the trust and desperation of grieving families to buy themselves time and cover. What made the Huntley case so infamous in Britain was precisely that willingness to stand in front of television cameras appealing for information about children he'd already murdered. And by drawing that direct comparison, Staffordshire police were making unmistakably clear just how calculated and sustained they considered Sterling's own performance during Samantha's search to have been. Not a single lapse in judgment, but a role he maintained convincingly for over a week. In the days following Samantha's death, well before Sterling's arrest, well-wishers across the community had already raised more than £15,800 to help her family cover funeral costs, a small but meaningful reflection of just how widely her disappearance and death had resonated across Stoke-on-Trent and the wider region. Colleagues at Royal Stoke University Hospital remembered her as an absolutely dedicated and committed midwife, a much-loved and valued part of their team, someone whose work brought new lives into the world right up until the final night shift she would ever complete. In a statement released not long after her death, her own family thanked the many people who had followed her story and tried to help, saying simply that her memory and legacy would live on, a message shared publicly before they had any idea that the man who had spent that week comforting them was the very person responsible for taking her from them in the first place. What makes the Samantha Eastwood case so difficult to sit with, even years later, isn't simply the act of violence that ended her life, sudden and unplanned as both prosecution and defense agreed it ultimately was. It's the days that followed it, the deliberate, sustained performance Michael Sterling gave as a concerned family friend joining the search for a woman he had already buried, comforting her sister with one hand while having already wrapped Samantha's body in tape and a duvet cover with the other. For a family already living through the worst days of their lives, that betrayal added a second, quieter horror underneath the first. The realization that the person offering them comfort throughout their darkest week had been lying to their faces the entire time, and had been the only person on earth who already knew exactly how their search was always going to end. Even now, with Sterling serving out a minimum term that will keep him behind bars for close to 2 decades, the question that seems to linger longest around this case isn't really about the argument in that bedroom at all, but about everything he chose to do in the 8 days afterward, when he had every opportunity to come forward and instead chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to keep pretending, right up until the moment police finally uncovered the truth for themselves. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching. If you want more true crime stories based on real court records and verified reporting, subscribe now so you never miss the next case. Don't forget to like this video and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.